Welcome, everyone, to this edition of Executive Edge, Cybersecurity Readiness in a High-Stakes Environment, where we bring timely insights and sharp executive perspectives to the biggest challenges and opportunities facing today's business leaders. For financial institutions and other high-stakes industries, cybersecurity readiness is essential, not just for risk mitigation, but to ensure operational continuity, protect brand trust, and enable long-term business growth. So, how are executives teams preparing? What should CEOs, CFOs be asking and prioritizing to safeguard their organizations while still advancing strategic goals? Joining us today are two executives from Hartman who bring deep perspective in these questions. First, Shea is our Vice President of Relationship Development. Shea partners with leaders across financial services and other regulated industries to ensure their technology investments, including cybersecurity, are strategically aligned with the broader business goals. His cross-sector experience gives him a unique lens on how organizations are navigating and evolving risk and rising stakeholder expectations. We also have Chad with us today. Chad is a CISO here at Hartman who spent his career helping organizations in highly regulated industries design and execute cybersecurity strategies that are practical, risk-informed, and closely tied to business outcomes. He works directly with CISOs and executive teams to elevate cybersecurity from a technical function to an enterprise-wide priority. We're thrilled to have them both here to share their insights, so let's dive in. My first question, Chad, is going to go directly to you. You often say that cybersecurity isn't just a technical issue, it's actually a business risk. Can you unpack what that means in the context of financial institutions and how leadership should be thinking about it alongside other risks like credit and liquidity?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's common that financial institutions initially begin managing cybersecurity as a purely technical issue and have delegated that to their IT team to handle. But financial institutions continue to mature their information security programs. They really need to start managing cybersecurity as a business risk, just like they would credit risk or liquidity risk. Because if we're considering the business impact, they're very similar. A cybersecurity incident can result in regulatory penalties, reputational damage, loss of trust, and any other number of financial losses.
So what are some ways for executives to start? Let's say, I'm talking to a lot of bank CEOs and COOs, and they are in that spot that you mentioned where they're managing it as a technical issue, and they become aware, okay, we need to make the strategic shift. What do you recommend on how to get started with that? Like, what are some small steps in the right direction, Chad?
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is to establish an information security steering committee that's comprised of leadership from across the organization and really charge that group with the governance and oversight of the security program. I think initial reaction might be to, delegate that risk tolerance, security program oversight just to a chief information security officer and have them be responsible for deciding what's an acceptable level of risk to an organization or not. But I think the best way for organizations to manage that is to form that information security steering committee, document their cybersecurity risk tolerance or risk appetite, so that the chief information security officer's role becomes making sure that they can articulate the cybersecurity risk in business terms to that information security steering committee, again, to the leadership of the organization, so that they can determine what level of risk they're willing to accept.
Very interesting.
Yeah, the chief information security officer certainly will make recommendations on, what they think is an appropriate risk response, whether it needs to be mitigated further or if it's been mitigated to an acceptable level. And they'll even make recommendations on how to mitigate that risk further. But I think it's important to have leadership from the business side involved and charged with, making the final determination of whether or not that risk is acceptable to the organization or not, because it's up to that executive leadership to determine what amount of risk is acceptable to the organization. Every organization, every financial institution accepts some risk to do business. So we just want to make sure that they're informed and understand the risk that they're accepting.
Yeah, that sounds like it sounds like a big change, but from my perspective, it doesn't seem like an overly complicated one, because when Anytime you're talking to a bank executive, one of the first things they say that keeps them up at night is this issue. And so it's not like it's one that's going to be neglected, right? It's going to be top of mind. It's going to be one that they are intimately aware of. And so I think that's a great strategy by putting the onus on them to own that and be in close contact, in communication with the cyber team.
Well, my next question actually is kind of to both of you. Shea, as you're going to conferences and you're talking to different individuals, talking to bank executives, and Chad, like what you're seeing kind of in the market, like what are we seeing as right now in the threat landscape, especially the more novel emerging threats, and how are they impacting business operations? Like how are these things really making a big difference to how the business is able to achieve its goals?
Yeah, I'll just say real quick, and then I'll let Chad dive into some more detail. But I just got back from a state banking association conference where there were a ton of breakout sessions on a number of different things, but there was a keynote speaker that had about a 2-hour block to speak. Everybody in one big room, and he was speaking on AI and how it's influencing cybersecurity threats. And that was to the entire conference, mostly filled with top brass at bank executives. So it's certainly not something that is just being told to IT teams at banks. This is something that's super relevant. And the presenter went into very detailed, elaborate schemes from playing off as, mimicking someone's identity, like an executive of a company, or in this case, a CEO of a bank, and using AI to create deepfakes that are rapidly more accurate now than they were even just a few months ago. And that, I think, scared a lot of people in the room. But, he shared, like I'm sure Chad has in the past, with like, what are the realities? Where are we now? And I think the scarier thing, I think, after talking to some banks about it, is they're scared about where AI is now in terms of how dangerous of a threat it is, but they're even more scared about where it's going to be in 6 months, a year, and how do you plan for that? I mean, these threats are becoming so sophisticated that I think community banks, especially, that don't have all of these unlimited resources like other institutions may have, how can I defend myself from these threats as they become increasingly complex and sophisticated? So, Chad, I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think an interesting thing to mention too is that these threat actors that I agree are using increasingly more deceptive and convincing social engineering attacks to ultimately get their initial foothold into these organizations, are making their attacks based on opportunity, meaning they're opportunistic. So you can't really rely or think that you're going to fly under the radar because you're a community bank or you're a smaller organization. These threat actors do not discriminate in terms of their victims. So I'm seeing kind of across the spectrum of large down to small organizations be targeted by these threat actors. And some of the the more novel or emerging threats that I've seen are threat actors using fake CAPTCHAs, for example, as an initial attack vector, where they're convincing employees or to enter malicious code on their workstation by redirecting them to this fake CAPTCHA, which is something that's new, right? We haven't been training our employees to be on the lookout for these things or treat them as suspicious. It's something that typically has been used as a security tool itself, right? So now they're abusing that and getting victims to interact with their attack. Other things that we're seeing are some really elaborate tech support scams where they're actually manufacturing their own pretext by signing up the victims for a barrage of spam or junk email moments or minutes before they then reach out to the victims via phone of some kind, Teams call or a voice call, attempting to impersonate their IT team, saying, hey, we know that you've recently received a lot of spam messages and we need a remote into your device to assist with this. So I think, in both of those examples, the level of social engineering has just gone way, way up. And I'm sure that in many cases, these threat actors are leveraging AI to make their communications more convincing and, increase the effectiveness of their scams. And an additional, new risk that's recently for me kind of crossed over that threshold of theoretical to very real world now is the use of AI meeting assistants really, across the industries, right? So now more and more we're seeing these third party kind of freemium AI tools being used, maybe against your organization's best practices, but we've seen events where these AI tools may be used to record sensitive meetings and then store recordings and AI summarizations of those meetings within, these third-party applications, which puts a risk there, for where that information is being stored, who has access to it. In some cases, we've seen where the web links to the content that's been recorded can be reached by anybody with the link. So it's not just restricted to just the attendees of those meetings. So that's something that, we're putting out there on risk registers and my clients, and we're reviewing how we're mitigating the risk associated with those things.
Great point, Chad, because third-party solutions are really at this point kind of very ingrained in what the actual user expects to be able to use within their, when they're working for an organization. So what's the real risk and exposure, and how can leaders manage that risk without slowing down growth? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure we're still growing and able to do these different things to improve operational efficiency, but that brings new risks. So how are they able to mitigate that best?
Yeah, I think, really there's a lot of risk associated with it, but there's two sides of it. Software as a service and these third-party applications enable us to be really agile and nimble in terms of being able to provide technical solutions for business problems. And in a lot of ways, they can be very secure because they're, we're offloading some of that overhead in terms of security to a third party, but we've got to make sure we're doing the appropriate due diligence, because that third party's cybersecurity posture or maturity of their security program is going to have a direct impact on your reputational risk and, and data security within your environment. So it certainly is a risk with how easily, shadow IT or, services can be spun up. Gone are the days of traditional IT where you had to put in a request to a centralized IT department to request a new technology to be installed, right? So we can, employees and, users can go out there and find their tools and bring them in. So got to make sure we have, acceptable use policies that articulate what our expectations are of our employees so that we can, hold them accountable for that. And then in some cases, there are some technical controls that are common sense to make sure that employees aren't inadvertently or unknowingly registering these third-party applications within our secure environments.
That's a great point. With that, my last question for you guys: how are executives teams ensuring that cybersecurity strategies are aligned with business growth plans, M&A activity, and digital transformation efforts? Because we know at the end of the day, all the financial institutions that we are speaking with are trying to grow regardless of what's going on within the economy. So how are you guys ensuring that they're able to do that within the cybersecurity needs?
Well, I'll just say real quick, our main thesis at Hartman is aligning IT and cybersecurity strategies to the business strategy. And so in my mind, that's where it starts. And so I love this question, this topic, because as you're building out your cybersecurity strategy and program, this is the main question you need to be asking at every turn is this steering committee? How is this steering committee set up? How often are they meeting? Where are we presenting the findings to? Where's the feedback loop? These are all questions that CEOs should be asking in order to make sure that they're aligned. But Chad, what are you seeing on the ground on a daily basis?
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think that making sure that your cybersecurity program strategy is aligned directly with your overall organization's strategic plan is really important. You want to be able to connect the dots so people understand that the information security program or the cybersecurity program isn't an audit function. It isn't a department of like, no, you can't do that, right? Our job is to enable you to do the things that you need to do in the most secure way possible. So we want to make sure that we don't trip over our shoelaces out of the gate with some sort of a security event. And I think the way that you can do that is having your security teams integrated into projects, into major initiatives from the start, so they can be advising you on security best practices. So we build these tools, build these capabilities with security in mind up front, and not trying to bolt it on after the fact, once it's in production and once it's in effect, or once there's been a security incident, right? A lot of times you'll see people get really serious about cybersecurity after there's been a security incident. So I think getting our teams, our cybersecurity teams involved in these things up front is really important. And being able to demonstrate to people, how you connect those dots between the different tools within the security program, different efforts and initiatives within the security program, how do those align? How do those support those strategic goals? Because it might not be obvious at first.
That's a great point there, Chad, because very often, it is cybersecurity team is, to your point, often seen as that department of no. Should that be a red flag to a CEO if he feels like, I need to do this, I need to do that, but if I go to my cybersecurity team, they're just going to tell me no? Should that be a red flag that they need to be looking at, other options on how their team is set up?
I think that is a red flag or an indicator you might have some issues, some challenges you got to deal with. There's definitely an opportunity there to improve the security program and make sure that it's effective. Because I think if it gets into that mode, people are just going to work around you, and you're going to find yourself left out, and you're going to be, ultimately in a much more risky situation if your business, if your employees are working around the security program than working with it.
Yeah, we're in really challenging times because the bank executives that I talk to, some of them, it seems like, are still living by the playbook of 2019, which worked then. But I mean, Chad, tell me if you agree. Just so many things in this space have changed. And before, it seems like it was a luxury to have your cybersecurity strategy fully aligned. But now it's not a luxury, it's a requirement now. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that your cybersecurity program, if it's really working effectively and it's in support of the business, it can be a differentiator, right? You being able to bring products to market securely and providing top tier security to your existing tools and services is going to be a differentiator, because it's a cybersecurity incident that impacts your customers, your members, your clients is going to be a very bad user experience, right? It's going to be a very bad customer experience. So I think if you can deliver your business in a very secure way, that's a differentiator for you.
Well, thank you, Chad. Thank you, Shea, so much for your time today. And for our listeners, if you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe and follow us on our next Executive Edge session. Again, thank you both, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yep. Thank you very much.